Hello, this is Julian with Coffee Reviews, and today we'll be reviewing the Campo Hermoso Gesha Black Honey Processed Colombia from Langøra Kaffe. And there's the container right there. And Langøra, based out of Stjørdal, Norway. And this is part 16 of our 24-part KaffeBox Advent Calendar series, and the 5th time Langøra has appeared on this channel. And there's a lot to discuss with this review, so let's start by talking about Langøra, which is a coffee roaster I've been following for a couple of years now. And one thing I've noticed about them is they have started carrying a lot more experimental processed coffees, which transitions nicely into this one right here. And this one is an Edwin Norway coffee. And for anybody that does not know, we actually reviewed a couple of his coffees last year after they were heavily requested. And they turned out to be some of the more unique and wild coffees we had all year. So this combination of factors, a black honey processed Gesha from Edwin Norway roasted by Langøra, is one that definitely caught my interest. And again, the way that this works, the notes and tasting are made with the V60. This cup right here is made with the Chemex, and Langøra does have a brew guide on their website, which roughly translates to a 16.67 to 1 water to coffee ratio. And they suggest boiling water, so we upped the temperatures a bit for this one, so 98 degrees Celsius, about 208 degrees Fahrenheit. Now, in terms of roast profile for this coffee, even with it being a honey processed coffee, you can definitely tell it was on the lighter side, even relative to a lot of the other coffees we've reviewed in this advent calendar up to this point. Not necessarily the lightest out of all of them, but definitely still lighter by most standards and metrics. With all of that out of the way, let's go ahead and start discussing this coffee. And the first thing I was looking for, given the processing method, coupled with the fact that it was a Gesha, was to see what sort of clarity we were going to get from that first impression. And one thing I did notice was a very slight grainy quality to the cup, while the majority of the rest of it still had a very clean base to it with wonderfully nice clarity. So even though it had a slight bit of this grainy component to it, it was still on the cleaner side of things in general. Now, what was really interesting about this coffee was the aroma of the beans as well as the brew did smell a little bit more citric hoppy than I think I was expecting. Now, this is one of those coffees where I actually didn't get an opportunity to predict what we were going to have. I found out what this coffee was before I ever opened the container, so I was expecting to maybe get a lot more fruity of a vibe to it. This one, though, it continues to kind of skew a lot more in that hoppy direction after the brew, as that was the first impression I got from this cup, was a very citric hop sort of cup of coffee with a very strong herbality to it. So somewhat reminiscent of the other Edwin Norway coffees I've actually reviewed, which remind me again of a very hoppy IPA sort of coffee. Bergamot could work as a note, as it definitely has a very kind of herbal citric aspect to the cup, and it skews very heavily into the citric components, but that's basically the most dominant factor in this cup, was a very hoppy experience yet again. Not necessarily what I was expecting, and looking at the coffee, I don't think that's what you would necessarily expect, as there's not really a whole lot of citric notes listed on the coffee itself. However, when you do listen to Langøra actually talk about this coffee, you go, okay, that makes a little bit more sense. They say citrus as the first thing, as that's really what this coffee lends itself towards, is a very strong citric component to it with a very interesting sort of herbal component and an interesting spice as well. Now, I was hunting very hard for a lot of the other notes, so I did have a lot of focus to see if I could pull out the listed stone fruits, as those are the first two things that they have on there, apricot and mango. So with a little bit of a cool down, they can be felt, as well as the caramel that they also had listed on there with even more of a cool down and a heavy focus. You can feel those components, but this coffee definitely was a lot more in the citric and hoppy direction for me. So just kind of interesting, the experience I had given what the notes were for this coffee, as well as my previous experiences with Edwin Norway's coffees. All right, let's go ahead and put up the tasting wheel so you can see what we were getting. All right, and one level 5, so we will go through that one real quick, and that is the citrus fruit at a level 5. Yes, and looking back on it, maybe I could justify the florality at a level 5, because just like the coffee we reviewed from Coffea Circular, this one lends itself very heavily in that citric hoppy direction. So that citrus fruit right there, it's as level 5 as could be. It's very much on that side of things. So I don't have anything to say about that other than the fact that it really seemed to dominate the cup, but maybe not in as heavy of a sense as you might expect, given nothing else in this tasting wheel does reach that level 5. Now, I would say a little bit more abundant in the Chemex as opposed to the V60. I would say that I like this coffee more in the Chemex because even though maybe it didn't have as much depth and complexity, it really heightened the flavor profile of that citric hops specifically. So I think just providing it with a little bit more clarity and focus really did seem to do this coffee a little bit more justice in general. But let's go through the rest of the tasting wheel as we have a bunch of level 4s. The entire top of this tasting wheel is a level 4. And we'll start with the cleanliness level 4. Again, with the Chemex, it's actually on the higher side of that level 4, interestingly enough. With the V60, it's right there at that level 4. And it's actually kind of on the lower side. I contemplated a level 3 given that slight graining quality, which is not present in the Chemex. So that's a really interesting note I took away from the clarity of this cup. Finish, level 4. I think that's actually a big deal because in theory you would expect this one to have a very dominant and long-lasting finish as so many of the other ones have. This one did not. So that right there is a very interesting part of this tasting wheel. Level 4 seems perfect for it. Sweetness, level 4. With all of this being said, this coffee is very much right there at that level 4 mark. Not on the higher side, not on the lower side. I didn't necessarily think that this was an overly sweet coffee in any capacity, but still pretty sweet in general. And same thing with the acidity. I thought it was interesting that it actually didn't reach a higher mark for this coffee. It seemed to kind of taper off right there at that level 4 mark. So even then, not necessarily any higher. I would actually say, if anything, it was on the lower side of the level 4. And then the florality is the one that maybe I could make some adjustments towards. But if I'm being completely honest, I feel like the citric and the herbal component to it was a little bit more in line with this coffee than maybe the florality to it. So I think it's fine there at that level 4 mark, but there's a lot of other things to discuss in this tasting wheel, and some of these things scored kind of high, higher than I was expecting, and the spice is one, because this had a very interesting spice-like aspect to it, and I think that was kind of coupled with the very interesting herbal hops to the cup, so that right there is at level 3, which is higher than I typically experience for most coffees. That's also why the savoriness is at that level 3 mark, and the bitterness is at that level 3 because the citric hops really seemed to dominate enough to an extent that it was slightly bitter within the cup itself. Saltiness also at a level 3. So a lot of things that you don't normally see in tasting wheels and higher marks at those higher marks. Body level 3, that was one that was kind of interesting. It's a little lower bodied in the Chemex, not really surprising there. It was a kind of interesting silky sort of mouthfeel to the cup in the V60. So having it at the level 3, it felt kind of perfect, even if maybe on the slightly lower side of the level 3. Stone fruit, level 3, I think that's being a little generous, and it's one of those things where I definitely didn't notice it upon the first few run-throughs of this coffee. I don't notice it too much in the Chemex, but it's one of those things where I really sat down and focused hard on trying to find those stone fruits in this coffee, and it's one of those things where maybe it could have been a priming effect, but I was able to experience them after really thinking about them, after letting the coffee cool down. Same thing with the caramel, because that's a note that they have listed on here. Again, focused pretty heavily on trying to pull out that caramel from this coffee, and it had to reach about room temperature for me to experience it. And again, I was maybe priming myself into that one, but that's why it only reached that level 2 mark. I could convince myself more of the stone fruits, which is why that reached a level 3. But I think the main reason I'm saying this is because it just goes to show how strong the hops were in this coffee. Made it a little difficult to tell a lot of the other aspects that were in here, as I didn't necessarily think it was an overly complex coffee. I feel like it went heavily into one direction, which was that citric hops with this spicy herbality to it, and that's why those things scored higher and in abundance, while the things that were listed on this coffee weren't things that I necessarily experienced in huge abundance. All right, so my overall thoughts and impressions of this coffee. I think, unless I had it side by side with the rest of the Edwin Narenya coffees, this one is maybe the best balanced of the bunch, as it didn't really have the kind of heavy one direction sort of aspects as the other ones did, which had very long lasting finishes, and even if they were a little bit more clean, they didn't have the same sort of like spice, herbal kind of depth and complexity to the citric hops in the cup. I don't know if this is kind of a good explanation for what this coffee was, but it was just a little different. I would say maybe it didn't lean too one-dimensional into the hopsy IPA sort of components of the coffee, but rather just a little bit more well-rounded, balanced of a cup of coffee in general. Type of person I would suggest this coffee to. If you've enjoyed a lot of the other Edwin Narenya coffees in the past, this one has a very similar feel to it with what feels like a slightly more rounded experience overall. I know a lot of people really enjoyed that coffee. That's why we got so many requests for us to review and try it. And it turned out interesting, though I think I just like this one a little better. I can't quite put my finger on why that is, as I've charted the other ones to be maybe a little bit more clean. This one right here just maybe feels a little bit more like coffee as opposed to the other ones that felt a lot more like, well, hoppy beer in general. Tricky review. I think I'm going to leave this one at that. If you've by chance had an opportunity to try this coffee, would love to know your thoughts and impressions of it as well. If you're enjoying the content, give this video a like, subscribe if you're not already subscribed. This right here has been a review of the Campo Hermoso Gesha Black Honey Processed Colombia from Langøra Kaffe. Thank you for watching.